Yeah, the thing I find most tricky is when people don't recognize you particularly, but half recognize you.
There is a particular kind of silence that only one man in the world can make an entire theater laugh at. No punchline, no wordplay, just a face, a pause, and a decision made in real time about how humiliating a moment is about to become. For nearly 5 decades, that silence has belonged to Rowan Atkinson. But behind the elastic eyebrows and the rubber-jointed physical comedy is a story far stranger, far sadder, and far more complicated than the character who made him famous. Now at 70 years old, Atkinson has spent the last few years finally answering the questions fans have whispered for decades. Why did he always look so uncomfortable playing the character everyone loved most? Why did so many of his closest collaborators quietly walk away from shows that were, by every external measure, wildly successful? And what was it about a stammering, awkward boy from a farm in County Durham that eventually produced one of the most recognizable faces on the planet? To understand any of that, you have to go back to the beginning, long before Mr. Bean existed even as an idea. Rowan Sebastian Atkinson was born in January 1955 in the northeast of England, the youngest of 3 surviving sons in a farming family. It was not a household built around performance or attention. It was disciplined, rural, and quiet, the kind of upbringing where you were expected to work hard and not draw too much notice to yourself. That environment sits oddly against everything Atkinson would eventually become famous for, because almost nothing about his early years suggested a future built on making strangers laugh. What did define his early years was a stammer. As a young child, Atkinson developed a pronounced stutter that made ordinary conversation a genuine struggle. Classrooms are not forgiving places for children who talk differently, and school became a source of real anxiety for him. He has spoken since about how isolating that period was, how it pushed him towards solitude rather than the class clown behavior people might expect from a future comedian. He wasn't naturally the center of attention. If anything, he spent those years trying to avoid it. The detail that makes this part of his story so striking is what happened when he stepped onto a stage. Somewhere in his teenage years, in school plays and amateur productions, Atkinson discovered something almost clinical about his own speech. The stammer that dogged him in ordinary conversation simply wasn't there when he was performing as someone else. Speech therapists and researchers have long noted that stammering is often tied to the specific act of using one's own voice, in one's own identity. In the moment, performance can bypass that entirely because the words belong to a character, not to the person saying them. For a boy who had spent years dreading the classroom register call, that discovery was close to revelatory. On stage for the first time, he wasn't the boy who couldn't get his words out. He was somebody else entirely, and that somebody else spoke just fine. It's tempting, looking back, to frame this as a tidy origin story. Shy stammering boy finds his voice through performance, becomes a global icon. But the truth, as Atkinson has hinted at many times over the years, is messier. The relief he found on stage didn't erase the anxiety that came with being himself. It just gave him a very specific, very narrow escape hatch, and escape hatches, as anyone who has relied on one for decades will tell you, come with their own kind of cost. If you only knew Atkinson from Mr. Bean or Blackadder, his academic background would surprise you. He was a genuinely strong student, particularly in the sciences, and went on to study electrical and electronic engineering at university before pursuing a master's degree at Oxford, where he focused on control systems, a highly technical discipline centered on how systems respond to and correct their own behavior over time. He even began doctoral work before ultimately deciding not to complete it. There's an argument to be made that this technical, analytical mind shaped his comedy far more than people realize. Atkinson's physical performances are not loose or improvisational in the way they might appear. They are engineered. Every raised eyebrow, every half-second pause before a disastrous decision, every exaggerated recoil is built with the precision of someone who thinks in terms of systems, feedback, and timing. Comedy for Atkinson was never chaos. It was a machine, and he was the engineer who understood exactly how to make it break in the funniest possible way. It was at Oxford that everything changed, not because of his coursework, But because of the drama societies he joined almost as a diversion, it was there that he met a young writer, who would go on to become one of the most successful comedy and screenwriting figures in Britain. That writer saw something in Atkinson almost immediately: the ability to command a room using nothing but face, timing, and controlled physicality in a way that felt genuinely new. Their partnership, formed almost by accident in a university drama club, would go on to shape British comedy for the next 2 decades. By the mid-1970s, Atkinson was performing at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, then as now the proving ground for British comedic talent. It wasn't an instant triumph. Some audiences didn't know what to make of a performer who relied so heavily on silence and physical control rather than rapid-fire jokes. But the people who did understand it, understood it completely, and word began to spread that something unusual was happening in Atkinson's performances. What tends to get smoothed over in retrospectives is just how long and how frustrating Atkinson's path to television actually was. The BBC turned him down repeatedly in the late 1970s. Pilot ideas went nowhere. His stammer resurfaced under the pressure of auditions and interviews, ironically the very situations where he most needed to sound confident and in control. By his own account, there were periods during this stretch where he seriously considered abandoning comedy altogether and returning to a more conventional engineering career. The breakthrough, when it came, was almost accidental. A new sketch show was greenlit by the BBC, delayed by a general election, and finally aired in the autumn of 1979 to a brutal reception. Viewership was low. Critics were dismissive, some outright hostile. One of Atkinson's own future collaborators later said it was among the worst half hours of television he had ever sat through. And yet, for reasons that still seem slightly miraculous in hindsight, a senior BBC executive liked what he saw enough to commission a second series anyway. That second series is where Atkinson's career actually ignited. Freed from the pressure of trying to please a skeptical audience with conventional jokes, the show leaned into stranger, more physical, more visually driven material, exactly the kind of comedy Atkinson had spent years refining almost in isolation. A sketch involving Atkinson playing an unexpectedly articulate and furious gorilla became a sensation, spawning a catchphrase that entered the cultural bloodstream and helping the show win major industry awards. It was proof, finally, that his instincts had been right all along. Audiences didn't need traditional jokes from him. They needed silence, tension, and a single perfectly timed explosion of physical comedy. But success on that show came at a cost that would become a defining pattern throughout Atkinson's career. Internal conflicts over casting decisions, tightening budgets, and the sheer grinding pressure of producing sketch comedy on a weekly basis pushed the entire cast to a breaking point. Rather than milk a hit format for as long as possible, which would have been the conventional business decision, the cast made the unusual choice to walk away at the height of the show's popularity. For Atkinson specifically, colleagues have said this reflected something that would recur throughout his life: an unwillingness to sacrifice his own well-being for continued commercial success, even when walking away looked from the outside like career suicide. Atkinson's next major project took an enormous risk. Rather than replicate the sketch format that had made him famous, he co-created an ambitious historical comedy, imagining an alternate line of English royalty, filmed with lavish period sets and costumes. It was expensive, it was a gamble, and initially it didn't fully land. Reviews were mixed. The budget ballooned. The BBC came close to canceling the entire project after its first season, and the show survived largely on the strength of an international award that bought it just enough credibility for a second chance. That second chance changed the trajectory of Atkinson's entire career because the BBC forced a complete reset. Gone were the elaborate castle locations and enormous cast lists. In their place came a leaner, sharper, character-driven format, with a new CO writer brought in to punch up the scripts, and a stronger comedic ensemble built around Atkinson as the clear lead. The show that emerged from those constraints became something genuinely beloved, eventually culminating in a final season set against the backdrop of the First World War. A season that managed the extraordinarily difficult trick of being both consistently funny and quietly devastating. Its closing moments, depicting soldiers advancing into no man's land in slow motion, remain one of the most emotionally affecting sequences in British television history. Comedy and tragedy occupying the same frame without ever undercutting each other. By his own account, this period of his career, working alongside close collaborators he trusted completely, was the least personally stressful stretch of his professional life, precisely because the pressure wasn't resting entirely on his shoulders. That detail matters enormously for understanding what came next, because the character that would make Atkinson a household name across the entire globe would place the pressure back on him, and him alone, more completely than anything he had done before. The character had actually existed in embryonic form for years, dating back to material Atkinson developed while still a student. But it wasn't until 1990 that the fully realized version debuted on television, a socially inept, largely mute man in a tweed jacket, prone to solving ordinary problems through increasingly disastrous improvisation. The character barely spoke a coherent sentence across the entire run of the show. Every ounce of comedy had to be generated through Atkinson's face and body alone. The commercial success that followed is difficult to overstate. The show was distributed and beloved in territories across nearly every continent, syndicated in dozens upon dozens of countries, and became one of the rare pieces of British comedy that required no translation to land internationally because the humor lived entirely outside language. Multiple films followed, generating hundreds of millions of dollars at the box office worldwide and becoming genuine global commercial phenomena, alongside a long-running animated spin-off series that introduced the character to an entirely new generation of children. And yet, repeatedly across interviews spanning decades, Atkinson has said something that seems to genuinely surprise people. He did not enjoy playing the character that made him more famous than anything else he'd ever done. He has described the process as emotionally and physically exhausting, a role that demanded he express every single beat of comedy and emotion through silent physical performance, with none of the relief that dialogue or ensemble scenes might otherwise provide. He has said the responsibility of carrying an entire production on wordless physical comedy alone felt heavy in a way that other roles simply didn't. He has, at various points, said he looked forward to filming rapping far more than he ever looked forward. This is, on its face, a strange thing to hear from someone whose career was built on that exact escape from his own voice into performance. But it points to something more nuanced than the simple stammer disappears on stage narrative that gets repeated in shorter, less careful retellings of his life. Performance gave young Atkinson relief from the specific mechanical difficulty of stammering. It never promised to be effortless or enjoyable. A role built entirely around physical exhaustion and constant improvisational precision, sustained across dozens of episodes and multiple feature films over more than 3 decades, is its own kind of burden, regardless of whether the words come easily. Over the years, Atkinson has flip-flopped publicly on whether the character was truly finished. In the early 2010s, he suggested he'd like to retire it for good, saying there was something faintly uncomfortable about watching a performer well into middle age playing a character defined by childlike behavior. A few years later, he reversed course, insisting the character would never fully disappear. Later still, he suggested a return was unlikely but refused to rule it out entirely. That indecision isn't confusion. It's the natural push and pull of an actor who built an entire global identity around a role he has openly admitted was often more draining than fulfilling to perform. One of the most consistent threads running through Atkinson's career, and the one most relevant to understanding the pattern hinted at in projects across his filmography, is how often talented people around him chose to step back from massive commercial success rather than keep writing it. It happened with his earliest sketch show cast, who walked away at their creative peak rather than continue for the money. It happened again in smaller ways throughout his film career, as directors, co-stars, and writers cycled in and out of his projects, often citing the sheer difficulty of matching the exacting, engineering-precise standard Atkinson held for physical comedy. The pattern says less about any single falling out, and more about the kind of performer and collaborator Atkinson has always been: meticulous to the point of exhaustion, deeply protective of his own mental health, even when it meant sacrificing career momentum, and consistently unwilling to let commercial success dictate decisions that felt personally unsustainable. Several people who worked alongside him across different decades have made some version of the same observation that Atkinson treats comedic timing the way an engineer treats a system under stress, testing it, refining it, running it again and again until it's exactly right. A process that can be exhilarating for a project, but genuinely grueling for the people, including Atkinson himself, who have to sustain it for months or years at a time. Away from performance, Atkinson's personal life took its own winding path. He met his first wife, a makeup artist working on one of his television productions in the late 1980s, and the two married in 1990. They had 2 children together, and remained married for roughly a quarter of a century before separating in 2014, with their divorce finalized the following year. Not long after, Atkinson began a relationship with a much younger actress he had worked with on stage, and the two went on to have a daughter together in 2017, when Atkinson was in his early 60s. The age gap and the timing relative to his divorce drew significant media attention, something Atkinson has consistently declined to discuss in detail, at one point remarking that the only thing more important than not discussing his private life was declining to explain why he wouldn't discuss it. Away from relationships entirely, Atkinson has cultivated a long-standing and very genuine passion for cars, particularly performance and vintage vehicles, alongside an early and sincere interest in environmental technology. He was among the earliest celebrity adopters of hybrid and fully electric vehicles, driving them years before they became mainstream. That made it all the more notable when, in 2023, he published an opinion piece expressing real disillusionment with parts of the electric vehicle industry, arguing that manufacturing impacts were being understated, and that he felt, in his own words, increasingly like he'd been sold an incomplete picture. The piece drew sharp criticism from environmental commentators and produced exactly the kind of headlines that follow any public figure willing to publicly reconsider a position they'd held for decades. Atkinson, true to form, didn't seem particularly bothered by the backlash. He has never shown much interest in saying only what's comfortable, a trait that also produced a widely discussed speech he gave in the early 2010s defending broad free speech protections, a position that drew both strong support and pointed criticism, and one that ultimately contributed to a real change in UK law. There's also a genuinely dramatic moment from his personal life that rarely gets the attention it deserves. In the early 2000s, while flying with family over Kenya in a private aircraft, the pilot lost consciousness mid-flight. Atkinson, who had no formal flight training, took the controls and managed to keep the aircraft stable until the pilot regained consciousness and was able to land safely. It's a strange footnote for a man best known for playing one of the most incompetent characters in television history in a real emergency, with real stakes. He was anything but. Atkinson turned 70 in January of 2025, a milestone that inevitably generated an outpouring of retrospectives, tribute compilations, and renewed speculation about whether he's finally truly done with physical comedy. He returned to demanding slapstick work as recently as 2022 in a streaming series where he played a